Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Freudian Minutes. We're going to be looking at the priesthood that we have been addressing. This is actually part two because we've addressed this particular priesthood before with respect to Leviathan, but I want to provide a little bit more insight into this priesthood because this priesthood is very important in terms of the history of America, and it speaks to this theocratic dynamic that we actually have going on. We're going to venture back into this dynamic of America in the Bible, but we need to address this particular priesthood before we do that. This priesthood is the Levite priesthood. It's important to remember that even though there's that ITE at the end of these names, the real pronunciation is just E or a sound. And so it will be Levi or Levi or Levi. And so that's what we're looking at right now. With respect to the Freudian dynamic and the Levites, we are looking at a construct known as reaction formation. And this perfectly fits the dynamics, the history of these Levites. And so before we delve into the details of the Levites, we're just going to quickly look at this psychological construct, this Freudian construct that is known as reaction formation. And this is another one of those defense mechanisms. Now, one of the ways to think about this dynamic of reaction formation is that when an individual is operating under this defense mechanism, they may often present as a lamb when inwardly they are like a ferocious lion. And that actually is the essence of the Levitical priesthood according to Scripture. And so, with respect to a reaction formation, a person will be behaving in a manner on the outside that's opposite of their true disposition or their true feelings. And so, you might see this exaggerated niceness going on. They might be very showy in terms of presenting as good and wholesome. This is all structured to hide their true character, their true intentions. And so when an individual is operating in this way, they might present as righteous, present as righteousness, the embodiment of righteousness. They might also present as being spiritually supreme while having a latent character that is rooted in debauchery, unrighteousness. They may present as chosen and elect and holier than thou. But under that is this crookedness, the crookedness that you saw in the colonial pursuits, the crookedness that you saw in the relationship between the church and what was going on with colonialism, the relationship between the church and what was going on with slavery. And so you see that dichotomy. But again, reaction formation is about that outward presentation that is inconsistent with what is going on inside. And the outward presentation serves to guard against seeing what is on the inside of the individual. And so that is the essence of what we see with this Levitical priesthood according to Scripture. Before we go any further, I just want to point out that this is a little observation about Scripture. I really don't think that Scripture is for everyone. It's not structured in a way that can be read by everyone, understood by everyone, digested by everyone. It really is very coded. And so therefore, there's a question of what's really going on there. And so with respect to Levi, we see some interesting dynamics, and sometimes it's very difficult to reconcile these dynamics. And so this is an example of that. So this Levi is one of the sons of Jacob, of course. And he's the son of Leah. Now, what's interesting about this particular son is he has a particular disposition as a young person. And he goes from, in scripture, being cursed to being a curse. Okay? So he starts off when Jacob is making these pronouncements about the sons. Jacob basically curses him because of his character, because of his behaviors. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And so there's a dynamic there with this person starting off with one station in life and then flipping and taking on another role, another identity. Now, of course, we shouldn't be shocked by that because we see a lot of this flip-flopping of identities going on here. And so when Levi was cursed by Jacob, he was disinherited. He was divided and scattered among the other people, okay, the other tribes. So Levi, according to the narrative, has no collective tribe. There's no land associated with Levi. There's no homeland associated with Levi. There's no collective family group that's cohesive associated with Levi. Levi is essentially a diaspora. Okay, so Levi is a diaspora according to this curse. Now, this cursed son is cursed for a reason. The disposition of Levi is one of a slayer. So this particular child had a character that was rooted in slaying. And so we're going to look at some of the dynamics that went along with Levi prior to being cursed and then after being cursed, and what happened after being cursed. Now, this curse came about from Jacob based upon Simeon and Levi slaying an entire city, purportedly to defend the honor of their sister Dinah. And so because of this and the underlying character, Jacob curses this particular son, actually both of them. Then after this, there's the narrative of them, going into Egypt. And after they come out of Egypt, the Levites are elevated. Somehow in Egypt, they become the elevated family because Moses is a Levite. And so the Levite, as opposed to Reuben, perhaps, is the entity that leads them out of Egypt. And if you recall, there are narratives in scripture about these things that Moses was doing, some very interesting things that he was able to do that looked like magic, for instance. Okay, so anyway, the Levites are the ones essentially leading the children of Jacob, the descendants of Jacob, out of Egypt. This includes Moses and his brother Aaron, who becomes the first high priest, by the way. And so, according to the narrative, at the urging of the descendants, the tribes, Aaron, a Levite, creates a golden calf. And then the people worship the golden calf. And then Aaron blames the people for his creation of the golden calf. The creation of the golden calf and the worshiping of the golden calf leads to anger on the part of Moses and the deity that Moses is supposed to be representing. And because of this, Moses comes up with the idea that he needs to figure out who's on the deity side and who's not. So he asked, for volunteers basically, to identify, for them to identify themselves as on the side of the deity. And so there were volunteers basically. And then he told them to strap up basically and go throughout the tribes and slaughter the people. And so the people that did the volunteering, they were the Levites, okay? So the Levites volunteered to slaughter the people, and that's what they did. So their family members, extended family members, the people in these tribes. And because of this, they became elevated to be the elect and to serve the deity that Moses was representing. There's another situation with respect to a Levite later on, wherein, and the story, the narrative is very similar to what happened with Sodom and Gomorrah. And so there was this attempt to molest this Levite, and the men who purportedly did this, according to the narrative, they were supposed to be from the tribe of Benjamin. And this is related to a growing out of the Levite offering up his concubine to be abused. And when she was abused, she was destroyed. And then he destroyed her even further and pretty much demanded that there be retribution against the tribe of Benjamin. And there was. And so there was basically an all-out war where there was additional slaughtering going on with the Levite as the catalyst for this. And so the Levite history just in scripture, and that's not all of it, okay? There's a lot more going on with the priesthood in scripture. And oftentimes the punishment of the children of Jacob, the punishment was related to these wayward priests. Okay, so the Levites, they were the ones who had the priesthood, and specifically those who were descended from Aaron. But ultimately, the big umbrella is Levi. Okay, and so that's who Levi is, and that's a part of the history of Levi. And if you recall, we talked about Levi before with respect to Leviathan. And so now Levi, these Levites, have this interesting identity. Not only are they the priesthood, but they are warrior priests. So this is a warrior priesthood. Just imagine that. That's what they are. That's what they are understood as. Now, Jacob had a very interesting relationship with Levi. It's as if Jacob was somewhat cautious about Levi and Simeon. Jacob referred to Levi and Simeon as sort of being instruments of cruelty. And he suggests that they have a secret council or assembly. And we are talking about his child at this point. And so he's doing this blessing curse thing. But in doing that, he's identifying the character of his sons. And so inside of the blessings and the curses, you hear him tell you basically, this is who these sons are. And this is what to expect in relation to them in what is known as the end time. And so Jacob's total description of Levi involves presenting Levi as filled with anger and wrath and violence and cruelty and being ferocious. Now, this is all very interesting when considering the analogies for Levi. And so Levi has been analogized to a beast. There are some specific animals that have been related to Levi. One is a lion. As a matter of fact, that's the name for Levi. It's another name is lion. So Levi has been identified with lion, wolf, bird of prey. If you think about a bird of prey, an eagle is a bird of prey, okay? Leviathan and the Apis bull specifically. And here you see this interesting dynamic with respect to Star Wars. And if you are familiar with Star Wars, you know that there's some interesting relationship between biblical narratives and the Star Wars narratives. In Star Wars, there are these twins, Luke and Leia. Now remember, Levi's mother is Leia or Leah. And so there are these twins in Star Wars. These are Darth Vader's children. And their names, again, Luke and Leia or Luke and Leah. And the name is essentially the same. And so it's a perfect twin name for Luke and for Leia. Because Luke, Lu, means lion. And remember, these are alternate forms of Levi. And then when you look at the translation of lioness, you have Leah or Leia. And you can see that on the other side in the Latin. And so Luke and Leia are essentially lion. They are essentially Levi, LEUI. And here you see another very interesting translation related to those swapping out of letters. So when you're looking at Levi, of course, you know that you can do some swapping out with the W and the V and the U. And so what you see here is when looking at the word Lewis, Lewis is another word for wolf, Louise, loop. This is where the construct, the word lupus, comes from. Lupus meaning wolf, also suggesting a great masquerader. This is also interesting because when individuals are talking about the construct of psychopathy, for instance, with respect to psychopathy, there's often the suggestion that the individual who is operating in that framework, that they are operating often as a wolf in sheep's clothing. And so they are masquerading as a sheep, but inwardly a ravenous wolf. And so you see Jacob suggesting this about his child. You also see this reference to ravenous wolf somewhere else in Scripture. And so you see all of these animals that are associated with Levi. And sometimes people might not make those connections with the wolf and the lion and how they are interchangeable in terms of these transliterations and forms. But they are also indicative of this Abrahamic priesthood. And here you can see very clearly the letter interchange. You see Levi, LEVI, you see LEUI, and then LEWI. And so Levi goes into Egypt in this cursed state, but leaves Egypt in this elevated state. And so reflect back on the description of what has taken place. So what you see is this entity, this Levites, being cursed for being exterminating slayers. However, for the same behavior, Levi becomes blessed and elevated. Now, this elevation is very interesting because, again, there's a switching out of places in terms of family leadership. And so, as you recall, Reuben is supposed to be the oldest one. And so, in theory, he would be the leader. But Reuben is no longer the leader in the narrative. And Levi becomes elevated in the form of Moses. So Levi becomes elevated in this form of Moses. And the behavior that got Levi cursed is the same behavior that got Levi rewarded. And it's also the behavior that allowed Levi to replace the other brothers in terms of birthright. He was able to be the replacement. And in becoming the replacement, this entity has also been the entity that has the power in the world, because it's important to remember that in terms of Abraham and this blessing, that Abraham in the narrative is going to basically bring the earth under subjection. Depending on how you're reading it, that's what's coming out of it. And so therefore you have all these people, of course, clamoring to get the blessing, to be the ones who get to bring the subjection. Basically, however, when you have a monarch or rulers, you have the priest class that is behind them, that is really ruling them. So it's the priest class that's really in control. And you saw that even with the doctrine of discovery. How did we even have a doctrine of discovery? We had it because the priest class told the monarchs that they could go and take dominion. And so those priests that were doing that, they were operating under the auspices of Levi. They had taken on that Levitical priesthood role only in a New Testament sort of form. So you see the Levites essentially serving as the advisors to the royals. So you ultimately see the Levites being the royals, the Levites being the heads of the empires. And so these Levites essentially not only became the high priesthood, and remember we talked about Zadok, not only the high priesthood, but this high warrior priesthood, if you can imagine that. And so the Levites are closely associated with Rome and closely associated with Babylon. And it's very possible that when going into Egypt, that part of this Sethian dynamic came from Jacob or Jacob's descendants. Because remember, the origin of Abraham is related to Babylon. Okay, so it's sort of an out of Babylon family narrative. And so there are things that were a part of the culture that perhaps went with them as they traveled around, because they were doing a lot of traveling there. And so that's what we have here with Levi. Levi is associated with the monarchy. Levi is associated with the empire. Levi is specifically associated with Rome and with Babylon. And interestingly, got this elevation in association with leaving Egypt. Now, not only do you have this entity known as Levi, the Levites, engaging in this slaughtering dynamic, this slaughtering history, this slaughtering identity, but when it comes to the sacrifices, when it comes to atonement, it is the Levite that slays the sacrificial lamb. It's also noteworthy in terms of this diaspora that there are manifestations of Levi in the British Isles. And so you see these entities known as the Druids. And it's noteworthy that the Druids are found or have been found in what's known as the Isle of Lewis. This is in the Hebrides. And so the Isles of Lewis are, according to many narratives, the home of the Norsemen. And so when you're looking at the Isle of Lewis, you're essentially looking at the Isle of Lion, the Isle of Levi. It's also interesting to note that there is a particular clan that is associated with the Isle of Lewis, and it's Clan MacLeod. And Clan MacLeod also is related to the name Levi. If you see in the Scots Gaelic, you have Lloyd, and translating into the English as Leo. And what is Leo? Leo is lion. And Leo is another way of saying Lewis. So if you look down, you see Leo, and then you see Lloyd, and you see Lewis. So it's all the same thing. And here you see another interesting notation related to the Isle of Levi, okay, and Clan MacLevi. What you see here is that they are also known as the sons of Thor's cauldron. And so with respect to Norse mythology, this is related to Thor and Thor's cauldron, the cauldron that is used for creating weapons. And here's a little tidbit to think about in terms of history. One of the founding fathers was named Lewis, Francis Lewis. This individual was Welsh. You can see their depiction here. This person was a merchant and was also one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. This person was a representative for New York in the Continental Congress. There's also another very interesting connection related to Levi or LEUI. The name Levi, Lewis, LEUI, this name is not only a form for lion and in some instances wolf also. It's also related to this construct of light, interestingly. And so another form of this is lux. And so Levi is another name for lux or lux. And this is a word that essentially, or construct, that means light or light bringer. And so essentially, in terms of Jacob's sons, the son named Levi is a form or a transliteration, along with the wife Leah, by the way. This is a translation or transliteration, a form of the word Lucifer. So that's what that lux, Louis, Levi, light bringer, that's what that's all about. And historically, there has been a fascination with this name, Lux or Luke. And you see it not only in things like Star Wars, but you see it in terms of history and science. And so, with respect to the skeletal remains that we have in Africa and that have been found in the Americas, you have these two entities identified as Lucy and Luzia. What's also interesting is when you do the anagram of this Levi name in the English form, you see words pop up like live or live, but you also see what is apparently under the surface in terms of the character of Levi according to the patriarch Jacob. You see evil and vile. And so to wrap this up, we can see very clearly how this psychodynamic construct of reaction formation fits perfectly with the narrative of this entity known as Levi, with the stories that go along with Levi, with the character that is presented as the character, the underlying nature of Levi, according to Jacob. We see this dynamic of reaction formation, wherein this entity who is cursed for being this exterminating slayer, this entity is then elevated as an entity of righteousness. And so we are led to believe that righteousness is wrapped up in this entity known as Levi. And so the behaviors that Levi engages in, these behaviors are reformed and represented as good behaviors. These are considered righteous behaviors according to the narrative. It's very interesting because Jacob very clearly has identified these dynamics as unrighteous. He has identified Levi as an instrument of cruelty, and somehow or another, this instrument of cruelty becomes elevated to that which serves as the mediator between man and God.